Morning, everyone. Happy Friday, and thanks for joining us today to discuss the revised draft tariff language for transmission service and market scheduling priorities phase two. My name is Isabella Nicosia, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I'll be facilitating the web conference today. I'm also joined on the line by Anthony Ivankovich, our Deputy General Counsel here at the ISO, who will be taking us through the revised draft tariff language today, as well as some other members from the TSMSP Phase 2 initiative team who will be available on the line to answer questions as we go through the language today. Before we get started, just want to make you aware that this language was posted out on the website on June 14th. It's posted out on the Transmission Service Market Scheduling Priorities Phase 2 Initiative webpage. You can get to that page by going to CAISO.com, and then under the State Informed tab, you'll want to click Policy Initiatives. That will take you out to our main initiative landing page. And then down towards the bottom of that page, you'll see the TSMSP Phase 2 initiative page, and the draft tariff language will be one of the very first activities on that web page. Comments were due on this revised draft tariff language on the 27th. And then this call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only, so any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. And if you need, excuse me, if you need technical assistance during the meeting at any point today, you can send a chat to the event producer. Our event producer today is Silas. And then we will be taking questions throughout the call today. So if you have a question, you can raise your hand using the raise hand icon, which is located at the bottom of the screen. If you dialed into the web conference outside of WebEx and did not use that call me option, you'll need to press #2. That will enter you into the question queue. And then just a reminder for everyone to please remember to state your name and affiliation when making your comment or asking your question, just so we know who is speaking. And then you can also send your question through the chat. You can send it to me directly. Again, my name is Isabella Nicosia, or you can send it to all panelists. So in just a moment here, I'm going to bring up the revised draft tariff language, and we'll walk through that with Anthony, and then we'll leave some time here at the end to go over next steps. And then this slide here just shows where we are at in the California ISO's policy initiative stakeholder process. So we're here under the decision stage right before the tariff filing. All right, so let me pull up the draft tariff language here, and then I will turn it over to Anthony. Okay, and just confirming you can see my screen, Silas.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, thank you. All right, I'll turn it over to you, Anthony.
All right, thanks, Isabella. All right, first I want to thank everybody for taking the time out of today. I know everybody's really busy. I know we got the 4th coming up, so I really appreciate everybody taking the time to join us today. I also want to thank those of you who submitted written comments. They were very helpful. Today, I'll call out some of the comments. I'm not going to discuss, every word tweak or ministerial edit that we'll be making in response to the comments, but I appreciate them. And instead, I'd rather, focus on more substantive types of issues. I think my plan today is to probably take a few sections at a time in a particular grouping and then stop for questions on those rather than seeking questions after every individual section. So without further ado, I am going to get rolling, and we'll take like the first 3 tariff sections here. In 23.1, we did get a comment that in addition to referencing the wheel priority and non-priority wheeling as new firm uses, that those also include transmission serving ISO demand. We will make that change. On 23.2.1, one of the things we did, I just want to point out, is we added a definition of wheeling through priority, which I think makes this read a lot cleaner and distinguishes a wheeling through from priority from a priority wheeling through, which is really a scheduled wheeling through with a priority in any given hour. On 23.2.1, we did get one comment from NVE about sort of item 4 on the requirements for priority wheels. and about requirements. I will note that the tariff language here says information requirements in the BPM, not eligibility requirements, although I think where we include this language further on, it still says eligibility, but we changed this just to mean informational requirements, which can include, contact information, things like that are basically implementation type deals and not really eligibility requirements for the priority wheeling through. Well, I'm going to go against my earlier statement that I won't talk about word tweaks, but further down in that section, I think we use the word different than in comparing the wheeling through to the hours of the underlying firm supply contract. I think it was PG&E based on that comment. I think we're going to change it to non-coincident. I think that's all the changes we had there, and we had no changes or comments on 23.2.2. So I'm going to stop there before we go on and ask if anybody's got any questions or comments.
All right, I'm not seeing any hands in queue. Also not seeing any questions in the chat.
Okay, then I'm going to go on to 23.2.3, which is, a lot of info in here. So I will stop and take questions or comments after this individual section. One of the things that we did hear it from folks was about the whole resale contract termination issues. So to address a lot of that, we put a new rule in here that basically says up until 3 business days before the month or before your priority takes effect, you can basically release the capacity, any wheeling through priority, back to the ISO. You're not going to get charged for it, and you can release it back for any reason. After 3 business days, you have, after 3 business days before the month or before the wheeling through priority takes effect, you can resell that capacity, but not before that time. We also heard comments about folks who, if there's a contract termination, wanted to have sufficient time to be able to find a replacement. And I think we allowed either 60 days, the earlier of 60 days after the date of termination, or up until 3 business days before the priority would actually go into effect. We didn't receive any comments on that. We also had put in a requirement that if your contract is terminated, you have to notify the ISO within 1 business day. I think NVE and its comments suggested that we make that 5 business days. I think we are probably amenable to that, but with one caveat. If that interferes with the 3 business day notice requirement, so let's take an example of your priority starts on May 1, your contract terminates on April 25th, and you notify the ISO on May 1, you're going to be on the hook for the charges for that wheeling through priority because you notified us after the 3 business day deadline. So I think we're willing again to allow a 5 business day notice of termination as long as it doesn't interfere with the 3 business day requirement for when you can release without fault or when you're going to have to resell. So I'm going to stop there and take any comments or questions on that.
All right, it looks like Doug has a question.
For the Bear Municipal Transmission Group. Anthony, you mentioned that the release could be done for any reason, but I thought it was linked back to if the underlying contract changes.
So we've got sort of, there's separate provisions in here. There's contract termination, where if someone terminates, you notify us and we give you time to find a replacement contract. Also in there, if you want to release your priority for any reason, we're going to, contract termination, no supply, you found a better deal, we're going to let you do that as long as you do it 3 business days before the priority would have gone into effect. So that is not tied to termination.
Okay. I mean, that kind of bothers me because it's basically a free put option on the transmission. So an external entity could reserve this transmission 13 months in advance. And then, let's say weather conditions change and then they just decide they don't need it. And they give it back when it has no use for anybody, including CAISO loads. I don't know. It just seems like they can tie up the transmission, keep it away from native load to be able to do something with it.
Well, I guess on the latter part, I don't know how it's being kept from native load, because after the 13 months, after the 13-month period, the native load number is pretty much set until you get to the actual monthly RA showings. I mean, we needed to find an effective way to deal with, maybe somebody loses their supply. There's a lot of, legitimate reasons why this might happen. But
Yeah.
not only that, if they release their capacity, it's going to go back into the market for, whatever uses, non-priority uses, ISO load uses, other types of wheeling transactions.
Yeah, I think the problem I have with it is that, native load gets 2 opportunities, right? They get the 13-month ahead, based on the historical, and if they can do the non-RA showings. And then the next opportunity is month ahead. And the external parties, they get every month, they get 13 months ahead, anywhere within that 13-month window. And there's a extra priority given based on the term of the underlying agreement. So you could structure an agreement for multiple months to get the priority, and then each month decide whether you really need it and release it, which sort of undercuts the concept of the forward reservation process.
Yeah, and this is Milos with the ISO. Yeah, I think Doug, what you're kind of reacting to is to that concept for any reason. I think maybe we can be a bit more, because everything else that Anthony kind of noted, it's tied to a legitimate change in circumstance, and maybe Anthony, we can think about just being a bit more prescriptive, or at least not being as broad as for absolutely any kind of change, but kind of a legitimate business change. Yeah, maybe we get your point, Doug. Let us think more about how best to capture that, if you're agreeable to that, Anthony.
All right, let's. Do we have any other questions or comments on that?
We have Steve Keen's hand raised.
Hi, this is Steve Keen from Edison. I just have a question about the way this works. If an entity that has this has a contract, if the contract is canceled within 3 days, they have to pay for that month. Okay, I understand that now, but do they have to then cancel for the next? Is the priority canceled for subsequent months if they don't find a replacement?
Yeah, I mean, if it's a contract termination, it's better basically for whatever length of term that contract is supporting, I think.
That's right. That would be the intent, is that if, this is Milos again, that if the contract, if the underlying supporting documentation that supported the original reservation of service for of the priority for the term of the priority, if that underlying contract now terminated, then the entire PT wheel priority terminates, and that goes back into the pool of what can be accessed again in the relevant horizon.
But it might not be, it might be for the subsequent month, depending on when they let you know about the contract cancellation.
That's right. Yeah, I think remind me, Anthony, I think that the way we've structured it, I think there's if they know early enough of it, and then tell us, and we'll release the capacity, but they have up until that 3 business day time frame that Anthony's mentioning, to notify us of that change.
So,
and then for whatever term, if the term got pushed out to start a bit, later, that's kind of a reduction in service as well. But otherwise, if the coal contract terminates, it would be a loss of that PT priority for the term of that they established the original priority for.
okay, and they could resell for that. The was it prompt month kind of, but they couldn't resell for like 3 or 4 months.
I think we get to resales a little bit later, but remind me, Anthony, how we structure the exact tariff language on resales. You may want to, if you're able to answer that.
I guess I'm not quite understanding the specific question. I think under our rules, you can resell 3 business days before the month before your priority takes effect.
Right. I guess what I'm asking is, let's say that I had a contract for 6 months. It cancels within the 3 days before the month. Obviously I can't get out of that first month, the prompt month, but I can try and resell for that one. But what about the remaining 5 months? Can I try and resell for those, or does it just automatically go back into the?
No, that's a great question. Yeah, once you get past once you're within the term of the PT priority, then you don't have the ability to, even if your contract changes, you don't have the ability to just terminate and give that back. They'll have the ability to resell it, but once you're within that term, then the only option is for you to continue to resell it. Otherwise, you're going to continue to hold that priority and be subject to the charges. What I think Anthony's mentioning here is, if things happen prior to the start of the term, or 3 days within effectively the start of the term,
Okay.
if things happen before that, then you have the ability to give that capacity back, and we'll look to put it back and available for sale effectively. But once you're within the term, if something changes, you don't have the ability to just terminate that PT will priority that's already been established for you, but you can resell it.
Okay.
Is
Thank
that
you.
consistent, Anthony, with what I said?
Yes. Yes.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, not seeing any other questions.
Okay, let's move on here.
Oh, it looks like we just got one more hand from Greg Ribka.
Just a follow-up question on this. I know that we were talking about reselling in a little bit down, so maybe this is better to wait until then. But in terms of what we were just talking about, that of an entity that has the priority wheeling through priority, and they would then lose the underlying supply contract. But then it sounded like there's the ability for them to resell in later months. I guess I was just trying to figure out how that aligns with kind of the last section, the last line really within 23.7.1, which is the reselling section, but where it says that a wheeling through priority reseller cannot resell or assign wheeling through priority for the purpose of enabling avoidance of the firm power supply contract. So it seems like, yeah, I guess just kind of trying to see how those two pieces kind of comport with each other.
Yeah, and I don't have that visible here, but you know, I think the intent there, and correct me if I'm wrong, Anthony, I think the intent there was to convey that you're still going to, that entity is going to, once the term of the PT wheel priority starts, that if something changes, that they're still going to be, they can resell it, but the underlying entity that originally established that reservation remains the one that's financially responsible for continuing to pay for that priority. I think that's what, I don't have that section visible here, but maybe we'll call that thought when we get to that exact language. I didn't remember all the exact language you quoted, but I think that's what it was trying to convey, that the underlying entity that originally established the priority continues to remain responsible to the ISO for the payment of the wheeling access charge associated with that, even if they resell it to somebody else.
Yeah, because I'd say let's hold that, get back to that question when we get to the resale section. The next set of provisions are mainly ones dealing with ATC and provisions applicable to ISO LSEs. I think it was 6 cities comments. I think we are going to renumber these few and put them all into a separate subsection. All the ones that deal with sort of ISO LSEs and various requirements. One question, if we look at 23.3.2 as it reads now, and this came from NVE, and they had a comment about the whole need for this provision in light of the proposed decision at the PUC regarding the ability to count ATC for RA purposes, and suggesting that if that's passed, this provision is not needed. I will note the ISO has proposed that aspect of the PUC's decision. Well, the proposed decision. It's not a PUC decision. We have opposed that, but also it's not clear to us what ATC ISO LSEs can even be getting that could count for RA, because under this proposal, they're only eligible for the daily ATC request window, or maybe they can buy it on resale from somebody else who's acquired a wheel through and maybe wants to release that capacity. But that can only occur 3 business days before the month, which is well after, both of those events are well after any RA showing. So I'm not even certain how this can occur in practice, but again, we've opposed it. It would, even if it was a PUC approved it, it would not be an ISO rule. We do not, ATC does not, ATC without MIC does not equal RA under our rules. So there's, a number of issues with that. So actually, I'm going to stop and before maybe tackling other questions in this section, and stop and see if anybody has any comment on that.
Let's go to Mark Smith.
Hey, Anthony, it's Mark Smith. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I think the PUC approved that decision yesterday, just so that you want. So it does create a situation where the PUC may count something as RA that the ISO does not. I think that's in some ways parallel to what happens in local areas where the PUC may count certain battery storage resources as RA, but the ISO won't because of saturation limits. So it's another dislocation between PUC rules and the ISO rules, I think, that's emerging.
Yeah, I guess the question I would throw out there is how can, what capacity could even be counted for RA here? If they can't get it until, after the RA showings are also in, the cure period is ended, how can it count as RA for the month? Because the only ATC that I think they can acquire under our proposal is in the daily context or in the, a resale, which can only occur 3 business days before the month. And that's, well after the RA showing period.
I think you're right. I concur with your assessment. The PUC decision just generically suggests that when an LSE acquires ATC and they use it at Cobb or Knob, that it counts as RA. They don't specify how they would have received that ATC. And it is limited to Cobb and Knob. I just thought I'd point that out, and Anthony, nothing else.
Okay. No, thanks, Mark. I appreciate that.
Okay, let's go to Bonnie Blair.
Anthony?
Yes, go ahead.
Bonnie Blair representing the 6 cities. So it may be a language issue, but I would say, it would be sort of my interpretation, or I think it's an accurate description to say that when the CAISO takes into account non-RA supply, that CAISO LSEs identify, and that can occur in the 13-month ahead process, and it can occur in the month ahead process. When the CAISO takes into account that supply that otherwise hasn't been identified as RA, and subtracts it from ATC that's available to external entities, that's sort of ATC that's, quote, acquired, end quote, by a California LSE. And I'm kind of, I haven't been closely following the CPUC's decision about, ATC counting for RA, but I'm just kind of assuming that that's their interpretation as well, and that's what they're referring to. It's referring to the ATC that is set aside or subtracted from otherwise available ATC when in the 13-month ahead process or the month ahead process, a CAISO LSE brings to the CAISO a supply contract that isn't otherwise designated as RA.
Well, if that's what it is, and again, I'm only a little familiar with the proposed decision, but to me, they're calling that RA as opposed to non-RA that may be able to get some available ATC.
Well,
you're right.
I agree.
It may be a language.
I also think it makes sense. I understand you don't agree with the CPUC's decision on that point, but I would argue that it makes a great deal of sense, because if the ATC is set aside, it's going to be available for use to bring in reliable resources, and it's going to be set aside based on contracts that are supportive of reliable resources, or that involve commitment of reliable resources. So I think it should count as RA. And I know that the CAISO has said over and over again that, ATC isn't the same as MIC. And I hear you saying it again, but I've never understood it, and it makes no sense to me. So, I mean, I guess we're in an agree to disagree position, but that's
Yeah, I mean,
that's where we are.
I mean, the way our tariff reads now, if you don't have MIC, it's not RA. So we would
I
be
understand that,
violating
Anthony, but
our
I think
tariff.
I understand that's what the tariff says, but honestly, with all due respect, I think it's stupid. So, like I said, I think we're in an agree to disagree position, and just saying ATC isn't the same as MIC is not an explanation. There's never been anything that I could understand that would explain why, if you have ATC set aside for a resource, that doesn't support deliverability to the CAISO BAA. And just saying, well, the tariff requires MIC too, it is not an answer. Maybe the tariff should change. I think the tariff should change.
Again, buddy, I'm not all that familiar with our issue, but I know our planning folks have said the ATC does not measure deliverability to load. MIC does.
I know they've said that, but they've never explained it, in my opinion. I think it's semantics. But again, I mean, maybe it would be helpful to have an offline. I mean, and I don't think I'm the only LSE representative who thinks that. And maybe an offline discussion would be fruitful. Maybe there's a better explanation, but I've never heard an explanation. I've only heard a pronouncement. MIC measures deliverability, ATC doesn't. With no real elaboration or physical explanation or logical explanation.
And this is Milos. Thanks, Bonnie, for that. Yeah, I mean, I think we've spent a little bit of time within that proceeding, and maybe we can send some of that information explaining some of the differences, particularly because of the, what we're trying to calculate here with the resulting ATC is capability to flow through the system as opposed to sinking into the system, and that has certain differences between MIC and ATC ultimately. But yeah, I would agree here that I don't think we're going to necessarily solve the question here of whether, whichever way somebody gets ATC counts from MIC. I think the default starting point is they're not the same, and I think we've expressed that as well within the CPUC proceeding, and I think we can recognize that if an LSE does get their hands on some ATC prior to the showings, that may count for the CPUC showings, but it wouldn't necessarily for the ISO counting of RA capacity, just as there are some other differences in terms of counting rules, what counts for the CPC, what may not necessarily count for the ISO in other respects. But yeah, I would agree that I don't think we're necessarily going to resolve that different treatment and how the CPC proposes to treat RA backed by ATC. And I think it's important also the terminology. ATC here refers to what results from all the other encumbrances that occur ahead of time. So ATC is really the only remaining available capacity that's available for reservation to establish PT will priority, where the native load needs are termed a different concept of an existing commitment that's based on historical RA showings, historical non-RA capacity. But completely understand, Bonnie, and we can have an additional offline discussion. We'll share how we framed it, I think, in the prior proceedings of the CPUC, the distinction and where some of the underlying supply sinks, whether it wheels through or whether it sinks, it has certain impacts on topology, and that's how we've justified or recognized the difference between the two and the deliverability aspects. But yeah, I would agree. I don't think we're necessarily going to solve that within this particular element of the tariff. I think at this stage, the recognition under the tariff is that they are different and that MIC is still needed to support RA. And I think we can continue discussing whether at some point in the future, however entities get their hands on ATC prior to the showings, whether that can also at some point count for or be a substitute for MIC or a complement to MIC. But certainly appreciate the perspective. We didn't mean to necessarily get too much into the weeds of the CPUC decision here, but happy to answer any other questions, or Anthony, if you want to supplement anything.
No, I would ask if there's any other questions or comments.
It looks like we have 4 more hands raised. So let's go to Steve Keen.
Hi, this is Steve Keen from Edison. I want to follow up on what Bonnie was saying, and it raised a slightly different question. There's a provision, obviously, MIC is reserved based on historical, but also non-RA imports are that's what she was referring to. If an entity has a contract for imports that they don't count as RA, but they bring it in, they can get ATC for that. Now I'm wondering if MIC is looking at the total amount that can be brought in and sunk in the CAISO. How is it that they're able to reserve the non-MIC ATC?
This is Milos, and I think we've spent a little bit of time on this distinction as well within the initiative, but the hope is that the calculation of the native load needs, for the ISO is an approximation of, the contracted supply that ultimately will be supported by the MIC that's allocated and used to support RA supply. So the set aside for native load could be on most points fairly a close approximation to what's historically been utilized and supported by MIC and shown on RA plans on those import points. And whatever hasn't then could be made available for others to use and establishing that wheel through priority. I'm not sure if that Steve answers your question, but that's where
No.
The estimation of the native load needs is in certain ways a representation of the MIC that's been utilized historically to support delivery of imports. Not necessarily the entire allocation, but looking at what's historically been used to support.
Okay, I understand that, but I thought that there was also, if there was non-RA imports that had a contract, that they would also be part of that native load set aside.
That's right, and that's still the case. That hasn't changed. That'll be based on similarly looking at what's under contract for the load serving entities over the last 2 years, both RA and non-RA, in estimating those native load needs.
Yeah,
So it includes
how,
the stuff that didn't make it on the plan as well.
okay, but that's what Bonnie was talking about. That would be the ATC that she's then saying that should be able to be used for. In a sense, it's kind of a way around MIC, I think, is what essentially what she's asking for. And I'm not sure I'm just not sure how that would work. I understand we're probably not going to resolve it here, so that's okay. I just wanted to bring that up. The other question I have is, Anthony said that buying resale ATC, you have to be within 3 months. That raises a question. So if I have a contract for a year, and after 1 month the contract is canceled for some reason, the underlying contract is canceled, I'm within the start of the wheel through priority, so I am responsible for paying for that, and I can resell it. But are you saying that I can't resell the 11 months remaining? I have to do each month separately within 3 days of that month starting?
Yeah, I think you have to sell within 3 business days before your priority actually commences.
But then, okay, then your statement that you couldn't get that resale ATC except for 3 days before the month, so you'd miss the RA showing, that's not true. You could get it, so assume there's an entity that has, signs a year contract for import and gets wheel through priority for it. Somewhere in the first month of that contract, the underlying contract is canceled. They can't turn it back. They have to resell it. So if they resell the remaining 11 months, okay, probably not for month 2, but for month 3 on, that's well before the monthly RA showings.
I don't know, Anthony, if you're on mute, but
Okay,
I can,
well,
look to, yeah, we can see once we get to the resale section. Sorry.
Well, I think Milos, the issue there is once we have awarded ATC to a wheel, all right, that's unconditional. So
Right,
so assume somebody bought. So see, they have a year contract and they sell months 8 through 11. At some point, the LSE's only opportunity to show that capacity is 45 days before the specific month. But if
right.
we sell,
But if that resale happens in month 3 of that year-long priority, that's well before the monthly showing for months 8 through 11.
That's right. Yeah. So we'll get to this, I think, when we get to the resale language to make sure that this is not precluded or anything. But yes, the intent is that, if you have established reserved ATC and established a PT wheel priority across that monthly horizon, let's say in your example, 8 to 12 months out or so, if the contract changes, terminates, whatever, you have the ability to release that capacity back to the market, but you also have the ability to resell it that far. And if you resell it, then whoever gets the resale, has that additional PT wheel priority. And we'll need to make sure once we get to.
I want to make sure of something, because you just said that we had the option to release it back to the market. If we're within 3 days of the priority starting, we don't have that option, do we?
Yeah, I'm not sure who you mean by we, but Anthony, correct me if I'm wrong. The way that we've structured the language here is if the contract terminates 3 months out, what's today? Today is June 30th. It terminates right now, but the term of the PT wheel priority starts in September. They have the ability to right now, since the contract terminated well before the start of the service date, they have the ability to release that capacity back to the market so that it can be resold, or they could resell it. Go ahead.
But if that priority started July 1st and went for a year,
Yeah.
and the contract terminated today, they could not release any of that back, right? They're on the hook
That's
for the
right.
full year.
Yeah. Once you get within the term of the reservation, you've started the start of that, or you're within those 3 days or later, effectively. At that point in time, you reserve the capacity. I can't do anything with it if you release it. So you're on the hook for it, but you have the ability to resell.
And then if I resell, say, month like January through March to a California LSE, right? Their monthly showing for January is due essentially November 15th. They'll know this ahead of that month. So they could show this on their RA showing to the PUC that they've acquired ATC for the months January through March.
That's right. If you acquire that through resale, whether you're a California LSE or somebody else, yeah, you can use it to support any kind of showings. Again, it may be different how it's treated within the ISO without the accompanying MIC, but for purposes of the CPUC, if that decision passed, then yes, you'll have the ATC that you can utilize to demonstrate that or for whatever other reason.
Right. Okay. So I think what Mark Smith was saying before is there could be a conflict between the way the CAISO treats RA and the way the PUC treats RA, because the PUC's the decision that they passed yesterday says that you can use that ATC to show RA.
That's right. That's right. And
again, CAISO, you won't take it. So
I guess a question I have, Steve, is how does that impact this initiative where we're counting both RA and non-RA contract showings? I mean, it seems to me it's more applicable to an issue where somebody, counts this ATC capacity for RA at the PUC. The ISO does not recognize it as RA. And then the question comes, we have the authority under our tariff to backstop RA deficiencies with CPM. And it comes, I think that's the issue, not anything on this initiative, because we're allowing both RA and non-RA showings to count. So how that affects this.
I'm not sure that you're right. That may not be an issue for this this initiative, but it is an issue that we as an LSE may have to deal with. Because you're right, what it means is we may not get penalties at the CAISO, at the CPUC, but we may get backstopped by the CAISO.
That's right, Steve. I mean, these are all kind of the same things that we've been noting within the proceeding as well, that potential disparate treatment, while it may count for the CPC, there may be other implications here without the accompanying MIC if an entity ultimately does go out of their way to acquire that ATC and rely on it to pass the CPUC RA showing, but ultimately when they show it to the ISO, it may be treated a bit differently.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Any other questions or comments?
Yeah, we have 2 more hands. Let's go to Alan Meck.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi, Alan Meck, SDG&E. I just wanted to quickly back up Bonnie's statement that she believes that she's not the only one who's confused as to the difference between, oh my God, hang on 1 second. I have someone trying to call me and they're very adamant. Sorry about that. Bonnie Blair is far from the only one who is confused and about this whole process and why we're jumping through hoops to try and get around calling something other than MIC. But yeah.
No, I think we understand that, and I think, you know, we should take this discussion offline because I think it affects a lot broader issues. But again, I'm not certain how that affects what's going on in this initiative, given that we are, you know, accounting for both RA and non-RA contracted supply. But I would agree that it's a broader issue that needs to be looked at in the RA and MIC context.
Yeah, and maybe CAISO wants to continue to treat this as yet another interim solution and start to work on an actual long-term solution, i.e. expanding MIC. Just a suggestion.
All right, Isabella, I thought we had one more comment.
We do. Let's go ahead and unmute Tyrone.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Thanks, Anthony, and thanks, ISO. Yeah, I also wanted to just throw in my support for Bonnie's description as well. I think the ISO has been clear on describing the difference between MIC as well as ATC. I think part of the need for further explanation or the lack of clarity is that it's difficult to imagine that flow through related to ATC doesn't impact MIC. So I think at one point the ISO had described a potential process in which the engineering studies, because I think right now the way in which the terms are described is that it implies that they're mutually exclusive. And I'm not sure the engineering studies would demonstrate that. So that's the part where I think further explanation to demonstrate, because there's obviously a relationship between an ATC on a path and the MIC on a path. And so to talk about them as mutually exclusive, I'm not sure that that's entirely accurate. The other part in terms of the relationship, and maybe I think, Anthony, you're probably going to get to it a little bit later, is that I think the ISO does have language that is exploring related to this particular tariff language related to this initiative that describes if a CPM is actually procured and what portions of the calculation, whether that's ATC or TRM that's being used. So as it'd be interesting to hear how the ISO is thinking about those CPMs and whether or not you would still consider those to be non-RA as well, if it's intended to use some component of this of the transmission capability on these paths. So I'll pause there, but that was just wanted to indicate my support for Bonnie statement and the need for additional clarification. But then also, I believe there is a relationship, but I'd love to hear, maybe it's later you're going to get to it, Anthony. Thanks.
Okay. All right. Isabella, any other questions on this?
No other questions.
Okay. The next on 2333, we had and this is again non-RA contract showings. We have a comment in here that the contracts cannot be contracts to replace other external capacity that becomes available, and what the reason is for this this language. I think a couple of things. One, if you counted original capacity and a contract to replace that capacity, I think the view is that you're basically double counting. But I think beyond that, planning for contingencies and replacements is really something that fits into, more a TRM type rather than a basic ATC requirement. So I know, Bonnie, you guys had that in a couple of places in your comments, so I will stop there to see if you've got any questions or comments.
I'm not seeing any hands raised.
Okay. All right. Well, maybe now we can, get to the question that, or comments on that, Tyrone and I think PG&E raised about CPM. So under this proposal, if the CPM is used for an RA deficiency, then we will take that out of any available transmission capacity that is still exists is still available after the monthly showings. If it's any other kind of CPM, significant event, I'm not certain we would use imports for an exceptional dispatch. So I think significant event is the more likely one. If it's for a significant event, it would go toward the TTC component, not the ATC component. And I think, I think again, the rationale here is that, we're looking at RA as being something that's set aside for native load. If that RA is not shown and we're replacing it with something else that's going to basically be an RA cure, we think that goes against ATC. But if it's a significant event that's unanticipated and unexpected, that's generally the type of things that TRM covers, load forecast changes, transmission outages, resource outages. And that's why we're taking that off of the TRM and not the ATC. So I will stop there again and take any questions or comments on that.
So as a reminder, you can raise your hand by selecting the raise hand icon, which is located at the bottom of your screen. I'm not seeing any hands. Do we have any questions on the phone only line, Silas?
We have no questions on the phone at this time.
Okay.
Okay, let's, we had no comments or anything on the monthly wheeling through priority. On the daily wheeling through priority, we had a good comment from 6 cities that, that clearly as part of this, it's not only a daily wheeling through priority, but also daily ATC to support, ISO BAA load. But yet throughout the section, we're really only mentioning wheel through priority. So we are going to make sure we reference, where we're mentioning wheel through priorities, we're going to mention the LSE piece, and I'll probably be using some acronym for that so I don't have to repeat the like 10 words everywhere else in this paragraph 6 or 7 times. But we will be recognizing that it's not just a wheel through priority, it's, ATC for LSEs in 23.5. Okay, 23.6, currently not used. Our plan is that the long-term ATC tariff provisions will go here. I know one commenter asked when we can expect to see those. I think our goal is to try and get those posted in the next 2 weeks. These are, extensive, it's going to be extensive material. It's, we basically have had to put in, although we're tracking the, the GID app, there's a lot of stuff in the GID app that just does not apply to wheels. So, although we'll be looking at, generator interconnection and wheeling, and grouping them in studies, we basically needed, we're developing basically a new GID app for wheels, along with the appendices that go with the GIDAP. We've had to put in new CRR provisions, also new long-term tariff language, as well as at least 2 new pro forma agreements for long-term wheeling and for basically, the construction of long-term wheeling upgrades. So it's going to be a significant amount of material that we'll be posting. Again, we're getting near the end of finalizing that, but I think with everything going on and the holiday and outages, our goal is to get this out 2 weeks from today. Also, as the ISO has announced, our plan is to split the wheeling through filing into 2 pieces. We will be filing the monthly and daily piece. Our plan is to file that in mid-July and ask for a fall order. That way we could start, getting out ATC and priority wheeling throughs, that people will know those as far in advance of next summer as possible. The long-term wheeling through, again, given the extent of the tariff language and the need for more iterations on that, we will do that, work on that through the fall with a commitment that we will file this in early January, requesting a FERC order in early March, which will allow anybody who's interested to submit a request by the first window, which is, I think, April 1 through April 15th, because we're going to use the same windows as GIDAP. So we would, get this filed, get a FERC order, and an opportunity for any long-term requests by April 1 of next year. So I'm going to stop there for a minute and take any questions or comments.
All right, let's go to Steve Keen.
Hi, it's Steve Keen from Edison. With the daily, I'm a little confused because there's been a lot of this talk about the difference between ATC for wheel throughs and MIC, which is ability to bring energy in. But then for these daily ATCs, you can use it for either. So that,
well, it will not be RA. That's, you'll be allowed to get that capacity, for a daily transaction. But again, that's not RA. That's capacity you've acquired, in the rolling daily window.
okay. All right. I have to think that makes sense.
Think about if you were in more stress system conditions, this allows the ability for some of that additional supply that's procured in those more stress conditions to effectively get some of the ATC and therefore be kind of afforded. Well, if we get into certain conditions where we have to apply that, priority equal to load, that some additional supply is protected within that process. If the LSCs are able to acquire that through the daily window process.
All right, thanks.
Okay, Mark Smith.
Run at this. Milos, I'm going to just make one more run at this. This is Mark Smith of Calpine. If in fact you are able to get this thing filed by July and you get an order in November, that means sometime in Q1 or Q2, people will know what strips of ATC are available for RA and for more particularly for wheels. I got to tell you, people are already lining up their capacity and energy for 2024 summer now, and having this delayed until that time frame is just going to be ridiculous, I think. So one more suggestion, one more call for extending the interim rules for another year. Allow us to move forward with the implementation of this new program on a pace that matches commercial transactions and negotiations much more eloquently than this rush procedure. So we would love to have, some confidence as to what's happening in the summer of 2024, and we won't have that until early, maybe even mid 2024. So thanks. Milos, you and I have talked about this before.
Hey, Mark, actually, I'm not going to speak for implementation or whatever, but, we will be seeking an order in the October timeframe. And I would hope that in the November timeframe, we would be able to run this, not waiting till January or February, which is the whole reason why we're getting this filed in 3 weeks or 2.5 weeks.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Anthony. I appreciate that. That gives us a couple extra months if everything goes according to plan. But as I said, people are already trying to line up their capacity and energy for next summer. And this puts us in the sort of chicken and an egg. You can't do a contract until you have transmission. You can't get transmission until you have a contract. Contracts that have to be written contingent. It's just a mess commercially. Let's try to figure out a better, more rational way to do it. That's all I'm suggesting. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, and Mark, this is part of the, we had originally set this for a September filing. One of the reasons we are moving this piece up to get it done early, get some certainty. But, also there's all the EDAM, DAME, and countless other filings that are going in. So our goal was to get this filed, get comments on it, and enter any answer we filed, get all of that done at FERC before we even file EDAM. But, this is the directive we've got from the board and the EIM governing body. But, also, FERC has expressed its, displeasure with these temporary measures. So our goal is to get this on, get an order, and get that certainty as soon as we can.
Can't blame me for asking, Anthony.
Nope, I
Thank
understand.
You. Thank you.
All right, no more questions.
Okay. The resale, again, I think, the big changes here, resales can only occur, 3 business days, after 3 business days before your priority would commence, not before. I think another change that we made, I think was in response to Arizona, is that you would, if there is a resale and we can accommodate it and without upsetting the wheeling through priority, that we would accommodate a change to the export point. So we have added that in here. I know there was a lot of discussion about requiring, the people, buying resold capacity to have a contract. We heard you, but that's not something we're willing to put in. Again, it's not an OAT requirement. That being said, that's also one of the reasons we put in the 3 business day rule. So we would not have resales occurring well before that. So we're cutting down the period of time on resales, and hopefully reducing, the opportunities where this contract issue might come into play. We've also added a sentence in here that basically, that we'll be asking, for the reason for the resale, that again, if DMM or whoever monitors these resales, they could, look to see what the business reason for the resale was. And again, the goal is not, we don't want people to be getting these wheeling through priorities, and then basically reselling them to just sort of do an end run about the supply contract requirement. But again, that's something, we've committed to monitor. If we see that, folks, maybe, DMM may look into that. They may want to know the reasons for the resale. and see what they were to make sure nobody sort of trying to just do this to end run around the contract requirement. So I will stop there and take any questions or comments.
I do not see any questions.
Okay. Moving on to some new discussion here that we added. And this is, transfers of capacity from a TRR rights holder to an assignee. And this could really, there's two paths that, this takes place. One, the TRR may directly sell or assign its TOR rights to a specific entity who might be able to assume those TOR rights. The second, which is, I think has gone on, it has already occurred at the ISO, is that the TRR holder basically makes its capacity available to the ISO in return for CRRs, and the ISO takes account of that capacity, as part of its ATC. We did get a comment, I think it was from Nevada, about how come we're not including ETCs here. One, I think most of the capacity we're talking about is TOR capacity. The capacity that PAC holds and that WAPA holds is TRR capacity, not ETC capacity. Our folks here, it is the understanding of our folks here, again, subject to check, but they don't believe that that ETC even has the right to resell their capacity under those agreements which predate the ISO. Out of an abundance of caution, we will put some edits into 2373 that basically, says, if an ETC holder has the right under its contract to resell, and that's reflected in the TRTC instructions provided to the ISO, they can resell that capacity. Again, we're not certain that anybody has that right, but if it is, this will allow for that. However, no ETC contract allows an ETC to make their capacity available to the ISO in return for CRRs. So we would not be making any changes to 23.3.4. That will only apply to TORs. I don't know if anybody from PowerX is, PowerX had a few questions for us. I think there's one or two that we need some clarification on. So I would ask if anybody from PowerX is on the call to get in the queue so we can talk about that. And other than that, I will open it up for any questions or comments that people have on this section.
Silas, do we have any questions on the phone only line?
There are no questions on the phone at this time.
Okay, not seeing any in the chat or the other queue.
Do you know, is anybody from PowerX on the call?
If you're from PowerX, will you raise your hand? Looks like we have Jonathan Neal.
Okay.
Hi, yes, this is Jonathan Neal from PowerX.
Okay. All right. So on your, you had 4 questions that talked about, TRR rights that are released to the ISO in exchange for CRRs and their ability to support a priority wheeling through. And the first question I think you guys asked, a market participant that holds TRRs from a CAISO intertie can confirm that they can request a wheeling through priority directly from the ISO intertie to any ISO export scheduling point. I guess there was some confusion there because it was talked about if the rights are released to the ISO, they are not really TOR rights anymore. And I guess that part of the question was confusing. To the extent, to the extent these rights are released to the ISO, the person holding the TOR is, we have contractual arrangements where they can get CRRs like they get today. This capacity would basically become ATC, general ATC, good for new firm uses at the ISO. And, that capacity would be able to support, priority wheel throughs in the system. But it's no longer really TOR capacity. So it wasn't, the first question, it wasn't clear whether you were talking capacity released to the ISO or capacity where a TRR holder directly sells its TOR right to an individual entity, which is a different situation than releasing it to the ISO. If the TOR is releasing its right directly to an assignee, you get the rights that the TRR holder has. That's not general ATC. You get you only get the rights that the TRR has, which, may only be from a certain, source and sync point. But if it's released to the ISO, it becomes general ATC. And, to the extent that's available, we can award a priority wheel through that. And if you get the priority wheel through, you'll be awarded, that ATC to support the priority wheel through.
Hi, Anthony. This is Jeff Spires with PowerX. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for raising that. And, this might be something that we should take offline and have a little bit of a longer conversation about. I think what we were trying to raise was just the mechanics of, to the extent that we have a TOR that is at the Malin intertie, how could we use that in support of a priority wheel, but also recognizing that there is that framework, as you were just describing, to make those make that TOR capacity available to the market in exchange for CRRs, and trying to put those two pieces together in a way where that conversion, where the TOR capacity is made available to the market in exchange for the CRR, would still occur, and the wheel through that is using that capacity would then be registered directly from Malin to whatever the final export point is, so that you would have a resource ID that you would schedule through the market from Malin to, say, Palo Verde, and the transfer capability associated with that would have been made available to the CAISO through that conversion. So I think I understand the point you were making around, it's maybe no longer defined as a TOR at that point. But I think what we were trying to do was clarify, as I just mentioned, the approach to make that conversion and register a wheel in a way that's consistent with that conversion. Is that helpful?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and somebody can correct me, but I think what would happen, let's say, PAC has, 500 megawatts. They release it to the ISO in exchange for CRRs. So basically, at Malin, so that's basically 500 ATC more that the ISO has at Malin. Parties can request PT wheels, and that additional 500 ATC would be available to award PT wheels. And you would basically, if you're awarded it, you would basically get it from the source point at Malin to your export point.
Yes, that's correct, but I think, or that's consistent with what I was saying as well, except for our assumption would be that the customer could do that effectively simultaneously and say, I've got, in that case, 500 megawatts or whatever it is of transfer capability. If I'm looking to use that transfer capability as the customer in order to support my wheel through request, I would do it in exactly the way that you just described.
Well, I guess I'm not. Are you talking about an instance where PAC has got 500 and they want to do a priority wheel through using their TOR?
Yeah, well, yes. In that example, assuming they're the customer, but basically whoever the customer is that owns those rights.
Well, it's PAC. PAC is the TRR holder, so they have the rights. So if PAC wanted to schedule a wheeling through from Malin to, let's say, Arizona, they would schedule, they could use their TOR to get to a point on the ISO, and then they would schedule from the sync point to Arizona as the sort of export leg of their wheel. And so they could use the TOR to support the priority wheel through. But again, that's not a situation where the capacity is being released to the ISO. That's a situation where the TOR rights holder is using its rights to support part of a wheeling transaction.
Right. So there's two issues that are related there. One is that in this particular instance, PacifiCorp sells that transmission capacity using its OAT to other customers that include PowerX. And so that's why we, our comments, we point that out, that we're a customer of PacifiCorp on that path. So, and then the second piece is that the example you just described there assumes that those rights remain as TORs that are effectively carved out of the market, as opposed to converting them, making them available to the market, increasing the transfer capability at Malin via the conversion. And so what we're trying to identify is, under that second approach, the methodology to be able to continue to make that conversion and at the same time use that additional ATC in support of a PT wheel request, of a priority wheel request.
So when you're buying the capacity from PAC, you're not getting their TOR right?
Yes, we are.
Because if you're getting their TOR right, that's not a release to the ISO. That's covered by the first, that's covered by 27, right? Sort of the first type here, where it's not released to the ISO and it's a direct transfer of a TOR right to an assignee. And I think in that instance, you use the TOR to support the import leg of your transaction, and then from the you schedule from the source, the sync point, to the export under the,
yes,
with the ISO.
Right, but those rights also have the capability to be converted to a CRR and turned over to the CAISO from a scheduling point of view. So that's why we're raising that, because that functionality already exists with those rights today. So we're trying to determine how that would work.
So if those rights are turned over to the ISO, the entity gets CRRs, but we basically treat that capacity as ATC, not as a TOR anymore. And
right.
That will become generally available.
So what we're asking is how to connect that to a PT wheel request.
So in that instance,
where we would register, because exactly like you were describing, in the first scenario, it remains a TOR, and you basically schedule the TOR, and then you would have a wheel beginning at the sync point. But I think in the second case, when what we're asking is that when you convert to the CRR and you increase the transfer capability at Malin, then the wheel could be registered directly from Malin to its ultimate destination in recognition of the fact that it's being added to the market transfer capability at Malin.
So all right. So I think, if I understand this, I think you want to know how you would split the TOR into a PT wheel with CRRs and one without CRRs. Is that?
No, I think we're just trying to, if we have these rights that we can convert to a CRR and we're trying to use them in support of our wheel request, we're assuming that we would be able to do that, still convert them, make them available to CAISO, and then register the PT wheel directly from Malin in light of the fact that we've made that conversion.
Yeah, I think this is probably a discussion we need to have with a broader group.
Okay.
Because I'm not certain how you get to keep the CRRs and keep the capacity if it's being released to the ISO.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting we keep the capacity. I'm saying that we would make it available like we do today, and it's just a matter of registering the PT wheel along with that.
Yeah, I don't think we're seeking to do anything different than we do today, and can work. Yeah, how we would arrange the PT wheel, but that's something I think that we can accommodate. So I would suggest that we have another call next week on this. I think we need some of the folks that are more familiar with it, but I suggest that we try and do that.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense to me. I think it'd be good to maybe walk through an example and just make sure we're understanding each other correctly, and then go from there. Okay. Okay. Well, I appreciate the discussion and taking up as much time as we did on this call, but let's see if we can find a time to talk about it in more detail next week.
Okay. All righty.
Okay. Thanks, Anthony. Take care.
All righty. All right, did anybody else, any other questions on the TOR ETC issue?
No, not seeing any.
Okay, let's go on to 2614.5. I think to make this a little clear, I think I'm going to edit the title to be, payment for wheeling through priorities, which we've talked about before. Also, in response to one suggestion, the CRR crediting is going to be moved out of this section into a separate revisions to CRR tariff language, which I think we already included, but I think it may result in one or more edits to that. But we will. That was a good comment to move the crediting to the CRRs. But again, this sets forth the payment scheme, gives some examples that it's basically, if your priority is based on a 6x16 for the month, you're going to pay your wheel through, based on that 6x16 for the entire month, whether you actually schedule in a given day or hour or not. You would be making that 6x16 payment. If it's 6x8, you would pay based on that arrangement. But I don't think I had any other changes to that section. That's probably a good place to take any other questions or comments that folks may have.
Not seeing any questions.
Okay. 34.12.3, the post-HAS process. I didn't get any comments on this. Again, we removed the provisions about the ISO's discretion on some of this and took all of that out. Yeah, no, and again, we didn't get any comments on that. As I just indicated a couple minutes ago, we did add a CRR, one of the CRR sections, the prepayment provision on the OBOLSIs to 36.9.2.1. So we moved the CRR crediting piece there where I think it fits better, not in the payment section. You know, again, the definitions, priority wheel through is going to get changed. We've also added the definition of wheeling through priority, I think to make things clearer and to distinguish, better distinguish a wheeling through priority from a priority wheeling through, which is really a particular schedule in the market. We've also added the definition of wheeling through priority reseller, which is not a term we had before, but recognizes that we will be, you know, allowing resales. Again, the long-term piece is being separated from this, so I'm taking out the reference to long-term and the reseller definition. I think before we go to Appendix L, I'm going to stop there and take any questions or comments.
As a reminder to raise your hand, you can do so by pressing the raise hand icon, which is located at the bottom of your screen. Do we have any hands on the phone only line, Silas?
No, none on the phone only.
Not
All right,
seeing any other questions.
All right, let me have a drink of water here, and then I will get back. All right, Appendix L, we had a few comments. In L11, I think we're making it clear, you know, again, some of these ATC provisions pertain to optimization in the market. Others pertain, you know, to determining wheeling through priorities. So for along those lines in, you know, L11, I think we're going to be adding some language that, you know, this is really focused on optimization of ATC in the market. In L13, we're making it clear, you know, making it clear that this includes any daily ATC that is acquired in the daily request window process. Moving to L3, L132, I think we were a little confusing about priority wheeling through and wheeling through priorities. We're clearing up some of that language to make it clear that, you know, this is the calculation of ATC for wheeling through priorities, not really a priority wheeling through. So before we go on to the native load calculations, I'm going to stop there and see if there's any comments or questions.
I don't see any.
Okay. All right. I think on the you know, native load sections, probably I think we're making some word tweaks here to make this read better, and a couple of sort of other errors in here, so we're fixing that. I think PG&E had some comments about the examples and sort of reference to sort of historic period and 13-month period. I think what we're going to do is change out all of those and basically refer back to the native load need calculations in L133, L1331, and L1332, rather than using some different terms there. So we'll be referring back to those specific sections where the historical native load is calculated. In L15 on TRM, you know, we're making it clear that, that we will do TRM, it says all applicable horizons, but we're making it clear that, that includes, the monthly horizons and the daily horizons I think the Six Cities had a question why we have all of this CBM discussion in our ATC calculation when the number is 0. Quite honestly, the ISO had the same question 15 years ago when we did not include it, but we were directed by FERC in their 890 compliance order to put the methodology, to put it in there, even though our CBM is 0. So in short, the commission told us to do it, and that's why it's in there. Isabella, that's all I have. So I will, again, open it up to any questions or comments that folks have.
Yeah, we have a question from Steve.
Hi, it's Steve Keen from Edison. I just want to make sure I understand what you're trying to do in the examples and what you're trying to show. So in the case where there's no ATC left and a California LSC comes in month ahead, they have MIC capacity and they bring in a resource to use for RA. If I understand correctly, well, let me just ask it as a question. Will that still count as RA?
Nothing the ISO is doing, nothing the ISO is just doing here is affecting what's the definition of RA or non-RA.
Okay, so if even though there's no ATC left, based on the historical summary, if I have an amount of MIC that covers what I'm trying to bring in, that would count as RA, but it wouldn't get priority. I mean, basically, it would be curtailed before the priority wheel throughs when the energy tried to come in real time. Is that correct?
Well, all right. Well, first, we're not saying what's RA and what's not RA. I guess the question is there's no ATC available, but I guess the first question I have is, are you talking about a situation where the RA showings and non-RA showings exceed what was set aside historically?
Yes. Because that's based on historical showings, and we know that there's MIC that goes unused at some point. So you could have a situation where, let's say at a particular point, let's say there's 1,000 megawatts at an intertie. Historically, 600 of it's been used. So you've set aside 600, and then you've set aside the TRM, and the rest of it gets sold as ATC. But let's assume that there's actually 800 megawatts of MIC at that point that's been allocated. So there's 200 of MIC that's not counted in that historic showing. So when we get to the month ahead showing, an entity could come in and say, hey, I want to use it. I've got 200 megawatts of MIC. Here's an import. Will that count as, so the first question is, does that still count as RA? And I think from what you said is it would. But the second question is then, if that would cause if the ATC, let's just assume there's 600 of historical for the California LSEs. Let's assume there's 50 for the TRM. And then there's 350 that's been given out as ATC. So everything's full, but somebody comes in with 200 megawatts of MIC and says, hey, I want this. What I'm hearing is that would count for RA because this doesn't say anything about RA, but that would not get any priority to actually bring in the energy.
This is Milos with the ISO. Let me just walk through the steps before we get to that. But yes, it would count for RA. Whatever you show on your RA plan meets the requirements. It continues to count for RA. It can be bid into the market at that interface, however it's being bid today. On your second question, if the actual RA showings exceed the historical amount that's been set aside for native load at that interface, we've been holding some capacity back effectively for those native load needs. the first thing that would happen is then we would see, well, is there any TRM that's been set aside for this type of an uncertainty, expecting that there may be this risk of excess of showing or excess capacity showing up compared to the historicals. If it's still beyond that amount, then you would look and see, is there any ATC that's left that hasn't been reserved that you would encumber for that? And if there's still, if that's still even greater than any of those elements, and there's still a gap, then yes, a certain amount of what's been shown, whether it's RA or non-RA, showing that's been protected. If you get into ultimately that corner case scenario, what would get that equal priority between PT wheels and ISO load, it may be a slightly lesser amount than what's been shown between RA and non-RA supply under contract, if that's your question. But it would first go through all of those steps that I mentioned of, seeing is there any TRM that's been set aside for this type of uncertainty? Is there any remaining ATC? And then, there's still the ability once you get into the daily horizon, then if there's any ATC there that's been set aside that can be accessed to potentially cover those imports that maybe exceeded the monthly showings that entities can vie for. And then ultimately, I think even once you get into the daily horizon and the periods of that these things are scheduled, remember there's also TRM that's been set aside for some of the uncertainty associated with additional imports needed as, the loads may be higher, et cetera, such that ultimately within any of those elements, there may be, we may still be able to protect those, a certain amount of imports under those conditions if we get into that stress period and we have to afford equal priority between PT wheels and ISO load. So there's different ways of eventually, once you also get into that horizon, in the daily horizon, to the extent some of these additional imports are scheduled, and depending on the conditions and what we've set aside TRM for, the TRM that's been set aside is set aside for imports when some of these more stress system conditions materialize. Those imports, if they're scheduled, whether they're RA or non-RA at that point, may be protected within that post-HAS process if we get into that critical condition. I don't know if that helps, Steve, but there's different ways of protecting some of the additional imports through TRM depending on what the conditions are on the system.
No, I get that. I think I was asking specifically about the term you used, the corner condition, where the TRM isn't sufficient, and
there's no additional lingering ATC that's still left over. Then
right.
In that instance, it wouldn't necessarily be protected, in that monthly horizon. But again, if that import is scheduled in these more stressed system conditions, there's TRM for different types of uncertainty that
right.
Some of those imports at the interfaces for which we're holding TRM for, they can be protected, in those more stressed system conditions. So, if that additional import is scheduled in that particular time frame that we're in stress conditions, that TRM would be supporting effectively additional protection of imports. So that capacity has been set aside for additional imports in those different corner conditions.
So let's go with the example I had where there was 350 given out for ATC to priority wheel throughs, and then the 650 that's left for the RA and non-RA imports. The 350 would be protected, have the same priority as load. Out of the 650 that's for California load, none of the RA or the non-RA or whatever, none of them would have priority for that, right? It would basically just be, there'd be 650 and it would be based on the market deciding how much or which contracts got to come in, right? Is that a
in your scenario again? If we've gone through all of those other steps of in the monthly horizon, TRM that may have been set aside for uncertainty in showings, if there's no additional lingering ATC there, and there's still some amount in the monthly horizon that at the point of true up, so there's a difference there of about whatever it is, 200, 300 megawatts that you noted. Then going into the month, we're not necessarily protecting for those additional 300 megawatts that if they're scheduled, they wouldn't necessarily get that priority. But like I said, there's TRM set aside. Once you get into the actual scheduling period, TRM may have been set aside for different types of uncertainty to be able to bring imports there. That some of the TRM is carried into those daily and horizons. That if you schedule those imports in those periods, TRM would be used to help support them and afford them that higher priority. So while going into the monthly horizon, the showings blew out completely any historical that's been set aside, any kind of TRM that's been set aside for this uncertainty of showing, any ATC that's lingering, completely blows it out of the water, that the showings are much greater than yes, going into the month, those would not necessarily have the protection automatically. But once you get into that stress system condition, and the uncertainty materializes for the other types of TRM that we've set aside, loss of generation, higher loads, etc., then that TRM and the capacity that's been set aside at that interface as TRM for those uncertainties, as that uncertainty materializes, then those individual schedules would be afforded that priority closer in time in that daily horizon or real time, depending on when the conditions are occurring. But that TRM that's been set aside would support an additional volume of imports being afforded that higher priority, consistent with what others do as well on other systems where that TRM is set aside for uncertainties and more stress system conditions. When you have to bring in additional imports, that capacity is set aside as firm capacity. And for us, those TRMs that are carried into that daily horizon would support additional imports then being afforded that protection.
Okay, I still have one piece I'm unsure of. I understand what you're saying with TRM and how that would work.
Yeah.
Within the amount that's been set aside for California load, whether it's from the historical piece or the TRM, but let's say that that's 650, and entities are trying to bring in 800 megawatts. They would be basically, how are the decisions going to be made as to which contracts get in? It's based on the market, correct? It's not.
That's
meaning,
right.
Meaning, if I had a historical.
That's right. These
I don't
clear the market. Yep.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions, comments?
I don't see any hands raised at this time.
Okay, no, everybody, really a great discussion on some of these. I think, in terms of some action items we need to take offline, a couple of discussions, particularly, on NIC, which I think is a much broader issue, but also have a conversation with PowerX on how these TOR matters will function. But I want to thank everybody for your comments. Again, everything's really helpful. Again, appreciate everybody's comments. And again, our goal is to be filing this tentatively. The date is, mid-July. I think we're aiming for July 18th to get this filed. So everything is done and filed before EDAM gets filed with FERC. So hopefully we are on track to get this filed on the 18th. Again, we're going to be seeking a FERC order in October, and in response, to Mark Smith, our goal again is to try and see if we get some certainty on this stuff as soon as we can, and certainly not be waiting until the first quarter of 2024. So Isabella, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. So yeah, as Anthony said, our next milestone here is the FERC filing in mid-July. And then if you'd like to check out any other initiative related information, a link to the initiative webpage is here on this slide for you. Do we have any last questions before we conclude today? All right, not seeing any. Well, thank you all for joining us and have a great rest of your Friday and a great weekend. Thanks, everyone.
That concludes today's conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.